Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speaker, Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam. Good morning, Senior Minister and Coordinating Minister for Social Policies, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, SMU Chancellor, Mr. Lim Chi-on, Pro-Chancellor, Mr. Eddie Teo, Chairman, Mr. Ho Kwon Ping, and the Board of Trustees, President, Professor Lily Kong, Provost, Professor Timothy Clark, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. A very good morning to all, and welcome to the 11th edition of the SMU Rih Hwa Leadership Lecture Series. We are honored to have Senior Minister Tharman address us this morning. Sir, thank you so much for taking time out of your morning to join us here. Now, besides the SMU students that are here today, we're also very pleased to host principals, students, and teachers from the various junior colleges, polytechnics, institutes of technical education, international schools, and other tertiary institutions. I hope you will enjoy your out-of-class learning today. And now, without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Ho Kwon Ping, Chairman of the SMU Board of Trustees, to deliver the welcome remarks. Chairman, please.
Senior Minister and Coordinating Minister for Social Policies, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, SMU Pro-Chancellor, Mr. Eddie Teo, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Singapore Management University and the 11th edition of the Rih Hwa Leadership Lecture Series. This series was established by my late mother, Mrs. Ho Lien Fong, in memory of my father, Mr. Rih Hwa, a former Singapore ambassador and businessman. She had hoped that global leaders sharing their experiences, insights, and opinions would inspire students and the public to aspire for greater purposes beyond themselves. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's founding Prime Minister, set a high bar for future speakers by inaugurating the lecture series in 2002. Malaysia's former Prime Minister, Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, gave the second lecture in 2004. Others who followed were also prominent Asian leaders with global stature, from Mr. Benigno Aquino, then President of the Philippines, to Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, Prime Minister of Singapore. Two Nobel Peace Prize laureates, Mr. Frederick Willem de Klerk, former President of South Africa, who co-shared the Nobel Peace Prize with Nelson Mandela, and Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, former State Councillor of Myanmar, also shared their very different but equally fascinating experiences. More recently, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, then Secretary General of the United Nations, and Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim, former Deputy Prime Minister of Malaysia, also graced the lecture series. Today, Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam is our 11th speaker in the series. With his deep insights into not only Singapore's, but the world's most pressing social and economic problems, Mr. Tharman will undoubtedly further imbue this lecture series with the prestige of being a platform for global thought leadership. SM Tharman has had a long association with SMU, having been guest of honor as Minister for Education at the topping out ceremony for this city campus in October 2004. But actually, even going further back in the late 1990s, as a deputy secretary at the Ministry of Education, Mr. Tharman was for a very brief period on the founding committee for the new university, which at that time had no name and no campus. I'm not sure whether he remembers this brief episode in his long and distinguished career, but like it or not, he was truly one of our founders also. And this is not the first time thank you, sir, that we did not embarrass your association with us by having done too badly since then. This is not the first time I've had the honor and the pleasure of introducing and then moderating SM Tharman in lectures or dialogues. His passionate embrace of deeply felt and thought through values and ideas, combined with a gracious humor and a gentle humility, which is rare in senior political leaders, has endeared him to all his audiences, whether in Singapore or around the world. Mr. Tharman has been Senior Minister since May 2019. He is also Coordinating Minister for Social Policies and advises the Prime Minister on economic policies. He chairs the National Jobs Council aimed at rebuilding skills and jobs in the wake of COVID-19. He had previously served for 8 years as Deputy Prime Minister. He is concurrently the chairman of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, MAS, Singapore's central bank and financial regulator, where he started his career. He is also deputy chairman of GIC and chairs its Investment Strategies Committee. Internationally, SM Tharman co-chairs the recently established G20 high-level independent panel on global financing for pandemic preparedness and response. He also chairs the Group of 30, a global council of economic and financial leaders from the public and private sectors and academia. Mr. Tharman led the G20 Eminent Persons Group on Global Financial Governance, which in October 2018 proposed reforms in development finance and the international monetary system to advance a new cooperative international order. He earlier chaired the International Monetary and Financial Committee, IMFC, for 4 years and was its first Asian chair. He also co-chaired the advisory board for the UN's Human Development Report in 2019 and 2020. He currently co-chairs the Global Education Forum. He's also on the External Advisory Group to the IMF Managing Director and the World Economic Forum's Board of Trustees. Mr. Tharman has spent his working life in public service, in roles principally related to economic and social policies. Besides serving as Deputy Prime Minister, he was Coordinating Minister for Economic and Social Policies for 4 years, from 2015. Prior to that, he was Minister for Finance for 9 years, from 2007, and Minister for Education for 5 years, from 2003. He has been Chairman of MAS since 2011. He led the Skills Future program launched in 2014 with the aim of developing widespread opportunities for lifelong learning and job upskilling among Singaporeans. He subsequently chaired the Tripartite Council for Skills, Innovation and Productivity, which was set up to drive and integrate national efforts to transform national industries and skills. Mr. Tharman also currently chairs the Economic Development Board's International Advisory Council and the International Academic Advisory Panel that advises the government on strategies for the university sector. Among his other roles, he chairs the Board of Trustees of the Singapore Indian Development Association, SINDA, which seeks to uplift educational performance and social resilience in the Indian Singaporean community. He also chairs the Ong Ting Cheong Labour Leadership Institute. SM Tharman was first elected Member of Parliament in November 2001 in Jurong GRC and has been re-elected 4 times since. After attending schools in Singapore, he studied at the London School of Economics and University of Cambridge. He later obtained a master's in public administration at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. And all these impressive credentials, which I could go on, but will not belabor you with more, have not weighed down Mr. Tharman with any kind of ponderous self-importance. He is not only very accessible, but also truly interested in the views of others, particularly young people. The many young Singaporeans from many different schools and universities gathered here today will, I believe, be truly inspired. And my problem is going to be trying to manage the long queue of people who are going to be asking him questions. So, Senior Minister Tharman, thank you for coming here to speak with us today. We look forward to hearing you discuss your topic, a survival kit for a fragile world. May I ask all of you to join me in welcoming Senior Minister Tharman.
Mr. Eddie Teo, Pro-Chancellor of SMU, Mr. Ho Kwon Ping, Chair of the Board of Trustees, Professor Lily Kong, President of SMU, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and the many young Singaporeans who are here this morning. We live at a time of profound global fragility and pessimism. It reflects the coming together of several insecurities, geopolitical insecurities, very obviously today, energy and food insecurities, existential insecurities to do with climate change and the risk of pandemics. COVID is not the last. And social polarization that is leading to insecurities within societies. The combination is complex and unprecedented. We've entered an era that is without precedent, certainly not in living memory. And it has led to a loss of optimism almost across the world. There are few exceptions. There's still some very optimistic societies in Asia, but by and large, it has led to a loss of optimism globally. There's data for this in the advanced world. Pew Research does surveys of optimism in some 19 advanced countries, more advanced countries, including Singapore. And the conclusions from this year's survey, done in March, were very troubling. Across the advanced world, barely 27% of parents expect their children to have a better future than them. Barely 27%. That's a dramatic change from the advanced world of the 1960s, even the 1990s. It's a dramatic change. In some countries, in fact in Japan, it is only 12% of parents who expect their children to do better than them. In France, it is 17%. Sweden is at the higher end, almost half of parents, about 47%. And Singapore was the only country amongst the 19 surveyed where more than 50%, about 56% of parents expected their children to do better than them. But across the world, that's a dampening of optimism in the future. And these are not due to temporary shocks or events. They're not just due to bad events and bad actors. These are structural insecurities that are going to be with us for many years to come. This is not just a perfect storm, a conjuncture of bad events. It is a perfect long storm, structural fragilities that we have to live with for many years to come. And our central task has to be to create bases for optimism in a world that is beset with crises and insecurities. Create bases for optimism. That has to be our central task, everywhere in the world and through global collaboration. We must create bases for optimism to see ourselves through this storm, this long storm, and to emerge intact, emerge a better place. And it can be done. But it requires first recognizing the realities, recognizing the gravity of the situation, staring the problems in the face. And at the same time, it requires more radical ambition for the future, more radical ambition in innovation and collaboration. We have to innovate and collaborate our way out of this storm. And it also requires recognizing that our interests as citizens, wherever we are bound up with each other, and our interests as nations are bound up with the interests of other nations and with the good of humanity, more than ever before. So it is fitting that we discuss this theme at a lecture series in the name of Mr. Rih Hwa, whose life exemplified a spirit of ambition and entrepreneurship, a willingness to venture out to the region and the world, and a life that exemplified a deep sense of duty to his fellow Singaporeans. So let me start very briefly in this speech by talking about the realities, these distinct insecurities which are now interacting with each other. First, and I will just highlight 4 key insecurities that we face. First, a period of extraordinarily low inflation and low interest rates is over. We now have high inflation almost everywhere in the world, and in particular, higher energy prices and higher food prices, both of which predate Ukraine. This wasn't just caused by the war in Ukraine, it was accentuated by the war in Ukraine, both of which predate Ukraine. The world has underinvested in energy, both in clean and dirty energy. Clean energy is not yet at the scale that we want it to be. Renewable energies are not yet at the scale. But fossil fuel energies have also been underinvested in, and there is now a global shortage. So we have to live for some years to come with higher energy prices, both fossil fuel-based and renewables. That is a transition which we must go through. We also have to expect a period of stagflation, slow growth or recession in a large part of the global economy, at the same time that we have higher inflation. It'll take some time for central banks to tame the inflation beast. And the price of having been slow to tame inflation will now be a sharper slowdown or recession. Second, the deterioration of the global commons is proceeding faster than our actions to mitigate it. This is the race for our lives. The race against climate change in particular is the race for our lives. And we're losing that race. Climate change, the loss of biodiversity, the growing global water crisis, all interlocking with each other, are seeing accelerating shifts, not matched by our efforts to mitigate and arrest these changes. And we are crossing many tipping points already. This is not just about 2050 or 2100. We are already crossing the tipping points. The melting of the Arctic permafrost is itself releasing a great deal of carbon into the atmosphere, methane-based, which itself will warm surface temperatures on land and in the oceans and accelerate the melt in major ice sheets and stressing coral reefs. Coral reefs, as you know, are where a large part of the ocean's biodiversity exists. So the tipping points are themselves tipping over other tipping points, like dominoes. And scientists have never had a way of estimating their impact. In fact, today's extreme events, the droughts, heat waves, floods, all the extreme events that are happening have exceeded what scientists expected. Southeast Asia, by the way, will be one of the most vulnerable regions in this century to climate change. The droughts, the typhoons, the floods, and in particular, the rising sea levels. So that's the second fundamental shift, and we are still losing the race. Third, doesn't catch the headlines so much, but we have to be very seriously concerned about the potential rollback in progress in a large part of the developing world. Sub-Saharan Africa, which is where almost all of the world's new population over the next 30 years is going to be, and Latin America, and parts of Asia. A large part of the developing world was already in debt distress before COVID and before Ukraine. And the situation is now worse because with rising interest rates globally, led by the Fed, the US Fed, and a strengthening US dollar, this compounds debt difficulties, particularly for countries that have borrowed in US dollars. A very serious problem. And these are countries which are also the ones most affected by extreme weather events, the droughts and the floods. There is a very real prospect, for the first time in decades, of famine occurring once again in the Horn of Africa, for instance. Very real prospect. COVID set back education everywhere in the world, but its consequences for education were most dramatic in the developing world. Pre-COVID, all objectives studies found that about half of all children in low and lower middle income countries, half of all children aged 10 did not have basic literacy abilities, unable to read and understand a very simple text. That's what's called learning poverty. The World Bank calls it learning poverty. 50% were in learning poverty. 2 years into COVID, 2.5 years into COVID, it's now 70%. And this is not just a short-term setback. This is life opportunities that now have been reduced. It is a permanent scarring of a whole generation. Very serious consequences, particularly for girls and women. Very serious consequences. And the consequences will not just be within their own countries, but there'll be forced migration, conflicts, quite possibly across borders, and the world will see those consequences. Fourth major insecurity is, of course, geopolitical. Ukraine is a watershed, the ramifications of which will not just be within Ukraine, but in Europe and possibly on a broader scale. And the ramifications may be catastrophic. But Ukraine is also quite likely a return to a world of geopolitical contestation after an interregnum of 30 years. We are back to a world of conflict. And within that world, the China-US relationship, which is now the most important bilateral relationship, is at its weakest point in decades. And I'll come back to that in a minute. It is the end of a unipolar world, but we are not yet in a multipolar equilibrium. We are still in disarray. And it will take some years for us to reach a stable multipolar world. These insecurities, as I mentioned, are interconnected. And it's important to understand that. They're not just separate events, separate insecurities. They're interlocking and reinforcing each other. climate itself has its own vicious loop: climate, water, and biodiversity. The water crisis, the loss of water from the soils and forests, is now denuding their ability to store carbon, for instance, reinforcing the climate crisis. The warming of the atmosphere is leading to a spread of infectious diseases and makes pandemics even more likely. The combination of climate extremities, droughts and floods, and global warming is feeding into a food crisis and feeding into conflicts. And the combination of higher inflation and geopolitical contestation is also reducing the political bandwidth to tackle the really big challenges, which are the challenges of the global commons. So we're really in a vicious cycle between these different insecurities, which makes it the most complex and profound set of fragilities that we've seen, at least in the last 80 years. And domestic polarization doesn't help. In the United States, climate change is now a matter of culture wars. Whether you believe in climate change, whether you want rules and incentives to support efforts to mitigate climate change, is now a function of climate wars rather than facts and science. So we've entered a world that is more polarized, faced with energy and food scarcity, slower growth, higher inflation, more unstable, less optimistic. That's the perfect long storm we are in. If there's a silver lining, it is that these extreme events that we've seen, not just conflicts, but the droughts, the floods, the heat waves, remarkable extreme events. Some of you may have seen the images of people walking on the bed of the Yangtze River. Remarkable. Pakistan, 1/3 of the country submerged, literally, and almost half of their crops destroyed. These extreme events all over the world, wildfires in California to floods in Pakistan, are finally shifting the political climate and public consciousness so that people realize that what's happening is not just to do with a distant event 50 or 100 years from now. It's not just our grandchildren's generation. It is happening now. The tipping points are being reached, and the consequences are now accelerating. So we have to create bases for optimism to see us through this storm and emerge fitter, stronger, and to arrest the fundamental causes of this perfect long storm. We have to innovate and collaborate our way through. And there are bases for optimism that already exist and which can be created. I will name a few at the global level before I come to Singapore. First, we are seeing scientific and business innovations. We are seeing breakthroughs at an increasing pace. If you think about what happened in the pandemic, it was remarkable. There's been no precedent for vaccines for a new coronavirus or new virus to be developed and produced so quickly. There were huge problems in achieving the right scale and disseminating vaccines globally, huge inequities, but the speed of development of the vaccine, a product of science and collaboration, was remarkable. And what is now being done in anticipation of future pandemics, which are coming, the viruses are coming, and the coronaviruses, not just the flu viruses, are coming. There's now blue sky research into developing an all-in-one vaccine that can tackle all future coronaviruses, not just variants of COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, but future coronaviruses. This is blue sky research. It is a global scientific community that is embarked on this, and it is one of the impressive features of today's world. Climate change, impressive business breakthroughs are being achieved. Take steel, for instance. Steel is a very important source of carbon emissions. Something like 8% of global carbon dioxide emissions comes from the production of steel. Green steel is now becoming a reality. In Sweden, which is one of the leaders in the field, there's already a pilot plant in the north of the country that has, in fact, made commercial delivery to Volvo of green steel, switching the process from coking coal to burning hydrogen. And the hydrogen is itself produced using renewable energy. Baowu Steel in China, the world's largest steel producer, has now set its ambitions such that it will peak emissions by 2030 and become carbon neutral by 2050, 10 years ahead of the Chinese national ambition. India is seeing its largest companies making major investments in renewable energies. The Adani Group, together with Total Energy, has embarked on a project to become the cheapest producer of green hydrogen in the world. The Reliance Group is making major investments in renewables, all trying to use India's scale to drive down the cost of renewables. Major investments. But these corporate investments and innovations, impressive in different places, are not themselves going to solve the problem. We need global collaboration. We need to unlock economies of scale. We need to unlock the financing required to be able to allow for a faster and cheaper transition to clean energy globally. It's not going to happen with a few market leaders. It requires global collaboration. And this requires multilateral collaboration, which has to be a third basis for optimism. We are at a weak point, in fact, the weakest point in multilateralism since 1945. This is not a Bretton Woods moment. Bretton Woods was when the IMF and the World Bank were formed at that time, more than 75 years ago. At that time, countries were emerging from war and devastation. And with memories of fascism, there was a desire to build peace through economic partnership. And they formed institutions, with the US being the leader at the time, to try to enable peace through economic integration and partnership. But this is not a Bretton Woods moment. We are not emerging from war and devastation. We are entering a perfect long storm. It's not even a post-Cold War moment like after the Berlin Wall fell, when the US was enjoying a unipolar movement. It was a unipolar moment in the world, that 10 or 15 years after the Berlin Wall fell. WTO was formed, other institutions were formed, many multilateral mechanisms were strengthened. We are neither emerging from war nor at a unipolar moment. We are entering a perfect long storm in a multipolar world that is in disequilibrium, in disarray. But there is basis for optimism, because we now have a common threat in the global commons, a common threat to China, the US, India, Russia, and the entire global community, which was not part of the equation in 1945 or in 1990. This common threat has to define how we organize multilateralism. When John F. Kennedy gave his so-called moonshot speech in 1962, setting out the ambitions of the ambition of the United States to send a man to the moon. At that time, it was a man. He said, "We're doing this, aiming to send a man to the moon and doing some other things, not because they are the easy things to do, but because they're the hard things to do." But he was talking at a time of the Cold War, and the ambition was not just to do something that was good for humanity, but for the US to take the lead and to be preeminent. In fact, he spoke at the eve of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now we have to do the hard things together. That is the only way we are going to address the challenges of the global commons. Doing the hard things together. And it means building a new multilateralism, a multilateralism that is reoriented, that repurposes existing institutions so that we focus on the common challenges that all nations face. And it can be done. We can repurpose the World Bank and the IMF to put the global commons at the core of their mandate, not just the problems of individual countries. Each time they have domestic difficulties or balance of payments problems, but the challenges of the global commons. These are institutions which are valuable and can be repurposed to catalyze a whole new era of public-private partnerships, mobilize private finance, join it together with public finance, so as to make the transition to clean energy, so as to make pandemic preparedness part of normal economic, social, and public health policy. We also have to refashion multilateralism so that it's not just the existing institutions based on membership of states, but mission-oriented network multilateralism that brings in states, corporates, philanthropies, and networks of civil society organizations. Bring all the energies and expertise together around a mission, tackling the problem of absence of clean water for more than 2 billion of the world's population, for instance, tackling the problems of climate change. Organize multilateralism around missions and bring all stakeholders together to address them. Can be achieved. But finally, for us to have a basis for optimism, we need a new US-China relationship. It's the most important relationship of this era, and it will define whether this century's geopolitics will be one of stability or escalating hostility, or even a breakdown of the rules and norms of the global order. And it is in the interests of both the US and China that those rules and norms exist. They need to be updated, but you need a global order. You need stability. And neither will be the winner if you have a breakdown in that relationship. It requires moving away from a win-lose mindset. And in domestic politics in the US, it requires moving away from what is now a norm of trying to out-hawk each other between the Democrats and the Republicans, between politicians of every stripe, everyone trying to be tougher than the other on China. It is tactical, it is short-sighted, and it is not going to achieve the interests of either the US or China or the global order. We need a new strategic relationship between the US and China that is shaped by their overarching common interests in arresting climate change, in ensuring pandemic security, in ensuring financial stability, and in preserving peace. And it requires rules of the game to avoid harmful competition, to preserve resilience in supply chains, to preserve self-sufficiency in certain sectors which are core to national security. It requires some rules of the game. But fundamentally, it requires interdependence. A world with China as part of the global market system and integrated with the US economy is a much safer world. It doesn't assure us of peace. It'll be naive to think that economic interdependence assures us of peace, but it makes conflict far less likely than a bifurcated world, a world of bifurcated technologies, markets, payment systems, and data. That will be a very, very troubling world, prone to conflict and escalating conflict. So the US-China relationship needs to find a new equilibrium for us to have a basis for optimism. Finally, I should just say that there is optimism in the shifts taking place within Asia. The rise of Southeast Asia and India is a major positive. It's not a done deal, but the potential is there, the energy is there, and the momentum is there. If you think about it, China is now 19% of the global population, and it's also 19% of global GDP, measured in US dollars. So it's about the world's average productivity level, China. Same share of population and GDP. If you take India, its share of world GDP is only 1/5 its share of the population. So there's tremendous potential to catch up in productivity. If you take Southeast Asia, its share of global GDP is less than half its share of population. Southeast Asia is quite large, it's about 9% of the world's population, but its share of global GDP is only about 4%. Tremendous scope for catch-up, and it can be done. These are regions which are continuing to integrate with the rest of the world, that are focused on exploiting opportunities in world markets, and which can invest more and better in human capital. That's a key ingredient for the future. But I mention this as a positive within Asia and a basis for optimism within Asia, the rise of India and Southeast Asia in the coming decade. Let me move on to Singapore, and I'm sorry I've been taking a little too long. Let me try and speed up. We too have to innovate and collaborate our way through what is going to be a very difficult era and emerge successful and emerge as an even more valued partner in the region and globally in the fields in which we specialize in. And there are bases for optimism. First and foremost, of course, refreshing and strengthening our social compact, which is the objective of the Forward Singapore agenda that DPM Lawrence Wong has launched. That's fundamental. The social compact is what defines Singapore. It's not our economic strategies, it's our social compact. And we start from a position of some advantage. The bottom 20% of our population by incomes is now catching up. In fact, income's growing faster than the rest. We have a higher degree of social mobility than most countries. And we have avoided the stark polarization that you see elsewhere. You still have the concept of we in Singapore, not us versus them. And we have to keep it that way. But we have to invest more and work harder at social mobility. And what will be critical, the most important initiative, will be in the earliest years of life, because that's where so much of life opportunities are shaped. We have to do more. We have to step up the scale and intensity of Kids Start, a joint effort by government, community, and with a lot of expertise being brought in to help families. We really have to step that up. But I just want to say, as a reminder, that the aim of developing a strong social compact is not only in uplifting those at the bottom of the ladder. That's important. We have to do it. Progressive wage model, various other ways in which we are strengthening job opportunities for those at the lower end of the wage ladder. But that's not the only objective. We've got to keep everyone moving up. Everyone has to be on an escalator, because it's the stagnation of the middle in many societies that has led to a loss of optimism. And we have to avoid stagnation of the middle, even as we help uplift those at the lower end of the ladder. And it can be done. We've been doing it for years, and it can be done. Keep everyone on that escalator. That's a basis for optimism. Second, Singapore has system strengths which stand it out in the world, but it needs deeper intrinsic capabilities in our people. Our system strengths are well known, a public education system and public health system that's among the better ones in the world, our housing neighborhoods, which keep people from all walks of life together, interacting together, a system of preserving multiculturalism and social cohesion. All these are system strengths that rely on not just hard instruments of government, but mainly soft instruments, instruments that build trust, instruments that shape norms, but it's a system. And everyone recognizes that Singapore system is strong. We now need, if we want to innovate and collaborate our way through this next phase of our development, we need deeper intrinsic capabilities amongst our people. Our people are competent, they're hardworking, reliable. We have pockets of expertise in many sectors, but we now need deeper intrinsic capabilities. First, and I'll mention 4 capabilities that we have to develop for the future. First, we need more depth of expertise and unconventional minds if we want to be a truly innovative nation. This is different from doing well in the PISA tests. We are amongst the top in the world in the PISA test, which is an achievement, but it's a different set of attributes. We do not do as well in the innovation game as several countries, several small European countries, for instance, who don't do particularly well in the PISA tests. They're trying to do better, but they do better than us in the innovation game through life when people are in their 30s and their 40s. We need deeper expertise and more unconventional minds if we are to succeed. And there's no formula for it, but it does start young, and it is to stay with you through life. We are moving in the right direction in our education system. A lesser emphasis on exams. Step by step in the last 15 years or 20 years, we've been lessening the emphasis on exams, and we have to move further. Discretionary admission is a very important part of that effort to lessen the importance of exams. And if you look at our secondary schools now, it started off with a few select schools having discretionary admission. Now it's across the board. Our polytechnics take in 20% of their students on discretionary admission, looking at their aptitudes more broadly. Our ITEs, 27%. Reduce the emphasis on a single track measure of success, and do everything we can through the formal and informal curriculum, through teaching and learning methods, to encourage people to think deep for themselves, think in original ways, and think unconventionally. Second intrinsic trait that we need to develop further is cultural breadth. We are remarkable for having a society that is multiracial, multi-religious, and multicultural, and peaceful. Quite remarkable. And it's our system that preserves that. There are 2 key spaces in that system. One, a space that allows each of us to practice our own religions and cultures and to get the assurance that comes from your own culture. And second space is the common space, where we all make some compromises. It's a common space not defined by race or religion. And in schools, we all know what it means. School uniforms are school uniforms. Everyone sticks to it. That common space is precious to Singapore. But we should now go further. We've come a long way, I must say. I'm 65 years old. I can tell you when I was young, and those of you who are the same age will know this, growing up in Singapore, it was very different. Race was everywhere in the air. It is no longer everywhere in the air. It was everywhere in the air, even when I was trying to hail a public bus every day. It was everywhere in the air. It is no longer everywhere. But we now can go further. Having achieved what we've built up, a system of peaceful multiculturalism, I think we can go further. We need a third space in our identity, besides our own identity, besides the common space. We can build a third space that is itself multicultural, where each of us feels that part of our identity in Singapore is based on all our cultures, taking a deep interest in others' cultures, building deep friendships, and treating that as part of our identity. It's not a melting pot. We don't lose our own identities, but it enriches us. And I believe we can develop this third space. Keep the emotional assurance of our own cultures, but let's develop that rich Singapore identity that includes a common space which we protect very carefully, but also go further and have a space where each of us in our identity does feel more multicultural. It is worth developing, and it will hold us in good stead in the years to come, when the tugs of religion and race all over the world are going to be accentuated. Many ways of doing it. We have to plow the CCA field a lot more actively in schools, including in all our neighborhood schools. You see it in some of our top schools, very intensive CCAs. This must be the norm, not just people nominally being a member of a CCA, but active training together in the dance, in the sport, in the musical group, several times a week, mixing with each other. We have to take conversational Malay and Chinese far more seriously. We started it about 15 years ago, but it hasn't quite taken off amongst our schools. It is not meant to be mandatory. It is part of the informal curriculum, but take it seriously because these are capabilities to be developed through education, not just nice to have. And we have to develop better knowledge of the region. It goes hand in hand with developing cultural breadth. We have to find ways of where every Singaporean grows up with a better sense of the region and feeling that we are part of the region. It requires engagement. MOE is now embarked on an ambitious plan where 70% of students will have some overseas exposure, and 70% of them will have exposure in Asia, Southeast Asia, China, and India. Ambitious plan. Previously, we were achieving something like 50-50, 50% having overseas exposure, 50% in Asia. COVID, of course, set us back, but we still have this plan. National Youth Council has some schemes, also quite recently developed an Asia-Ready Exposure Program to try to give Singaporean youth, including those in their 30s, the opportunity to do some stints abroad, but these are typically quite short stints. I think we should think ambitiously about this. In Europe, for instance, they have the Erasmus program, where tertiary students, and in fact teachers and lecturers, rotate around. As part of your university degree, you spend a solid chunk of time in another country in Europe. We should explore the feasibility of that in Southeast Asia, and possibly further afield in Asia. Not identical to the Erasmus program, but I think our tertiary students and our teachers and lecturers will find it meaningful. There's always some trade-off in terms of the integrity of the program you're going through within your own university, but I think what you gain and what will stay with you through life is more significant than what you trade off. Finally, when I talk about intrinsic capabilities, we need to develop the capability in every individual, that capability of civic discourse, the ability to listen to alternative views, respect them, find common ground where possible, but accept differences in opinion and views and lifestyles. We are becoming a more pluralistic society, but it must not be a more divisive society. And that requires a culture of civic discourse, a deliberative culture where you listen, you think critically, you accept differences of views, and you try to find common ground. And this is a capability to be developed from young and through our culture as well. One aspect of it that has to be highlighted is the capability of discerning facts from disinformation, which is now a major challenge everywhere in the world. The social media has unfortunately turned out to be not just democratic, which is a positive thing about the social media, but also polarizing and a source of industrial-scale misinformation in many parts of the world. Finland has a very interesting model. They were open to extensive campaigns of Russian disinformation through the years, and in 2014 they decided to systematically build it into the school curriculum, the ability, as part of a critical thinking curriculum, the ability to fact-check and discern facts from misinformation. And they built it into virtually every subject. In mathematics, learning how statistics can lie. In art, knowing how images can be digitally altered. In science, understanding vaccine disinformation most recently. They're systematic in the way they go about it, and Finland was found in Europe to be the most resistant to fake news. So practical schemes, but we have to treat this seriously. These are capabilities of the future. So let me round up, and I'm sorry I've taken a bit longer than expected. We have to develop bases for optimism in a world that is troubled not just because of bad actors and bad events, but because we are entering an era of insecurity. We can develop these bases for optimism globally, particularly by strengthening multilateralism in practical ways, and in our own societies, strengthening our social compacts, which in Singapore we are determined to do, refreshing existing ways of doing things, but also developing some deeper intrinsic capabilities for the future. I'm confident it will hold Singapore well in the years and decades to come, and I'm confident that we have what it takes to work together on this to ensure that we succeed and remain a valued partner for others in the world. Thank you very much.